There is a place on this earth where the land itself disappears beneath ice, more than 2 miles thick, where the sun refuses to set for months and then refuses to rise at all, where villages exist without roads connecting them to any other village, reachable only by boat, plane, or dog sled. Greenland is the largest island on the planet, and yet fewer people live here than in a single mid-sized city, scattered along a coastline carved by fjords, hemmed in on every side by an ice sheet that holds nearly 10% of the world's fresh water in frozen suspension. Roughly 80% of Greenlanders share Inuit ancestry, their communities connected not by roads, since almost none exist between settlements, but by boat in summer, small aircraft year-round, and dog sled across frozen ground for much of the winter. This is not simply a cold place. It is a place that asks something different of everyone who has ever tried to live here. Patience, humility, and an intimacy with weather that most of the modern world has long since forgotten. How does life not merely endure, but genuinely thrive, at the very edge of what a landscape can support? Follow the ice south from the frozen interior, out along the fractured coast, into villages where the old ways and the new world negotiate, quietly, every single day. This is Greenland. At the heart of Greenland lies something almost impossible to hold in the mind at ordinary human scale. An ice sheet covering nearly 80% of the island, in places more than 3 kilometers thick. A frozen mass so vast, it presses the bedrock beneath it down into the Earth's crust. Scientists who drill into this ice extract cores containing air bubbles trapped more than 100,000 years ago, tiny, frozen fragments of an atmosphere that existed long before any human being walked this land. The ice sheet is not static. It moves, slowly and relentlessly, flowing outward from the center toward the coast in rivers of compressed snow that took centuries to form and will take centuries more to fully release. Where this ice finally meets the sea, it does not gently melt, but calves, enormous chunks breaking free with a sound recorded by those who have witnessed it, as somewhere between a gunshot and distant thunder, the sound of ice thousands of years old returning, finally, to liquid water. For the earliest peoples who arrived on this coast, the ice sheet was less an obstacle than a fact of existence, as unremarkable and as absolute as the sky itself. Communities settled almost entirely along the coastal margins, in the narrow habitable strip between the frozen interior and the sea, because the interior offered nothing that could sustain a human life. No game, no fuel, no shelter from wind that could strip exposed skin in minutes. Even now, no permanent settlement exists anywhere on the ice sheet itself. The interior remains, as it has for tens of thousands of years, a landscape that permits observation but refuses habitation. Ice core research conducted at drilling sites across the interior has produced some of the most detailed climate records available anywhere on Earth, each annual snow layer compressing into a distinct band that scientists can count backward through time, much as a botanist reads tree rings, correlating volcanic ash layers, dust concentrations, and trapped gas ratios with known historical events stretching back over 100,000 years. Researchers working at these remote drilling camps live for months at a stretch in conditions barely less demanding than those faced by the earliest Arctic hunters, their equipment and supplies flown in by specially equipped aircraft capable of landing directly on packed snow runways. What these ice cores reveal is a climate history far more volatile than the relatively stable conditions that allowed human agriculture and civilization to develop over the past several thousand years. Sudden temperature swings, in some periods, of several degrees within mere decades, evidence that the relative calm of recent human history may itself be something of an anomaly rather than a guaranteed baseline. Scientists studying this record describe a particular humility that develops from working with ice this old, a direct physical encounter with timescales that dwarf any single human life, or even any single human civilization. Along the west coast, at Ilulissat, the Kujalik Glacier releases more ice into the ocean than almost any other single glacier on Earth, calving icebergs so massive that some run aground on the shallower waters of the fjord mouth, forming a jumbled ice barrier that smaller bergs must maneuver around before finally drifting free into Disco Bay. Local Inuit hunters have navigated these waters by small boat for generations, reading the ice the way sailors elsewhere read weather, which bergs are stable, which are actively rolling or calving smaller pieces, which channels between them will remain open long enough to pass through safely. Records from early European expeditions to this coast describe explorers' astonishment at the scale of the ice here, comparisons to cathedrals and mountains offered by visitors, encountering something their own vocabulary had no adequate word for. Some researchers believe an iceberg calved from this very glacier may have been among those responsible for the 1912 sinking of the Titanic, carried south on ocean currents over the course of roughly a year before meeting a ship that never expected to encounter something quite this large, this far from any polar coastline. Whether or not this particular iceberg's origin can ever be confirmed, the glacier's capacity to produce ice on that scale remains, each season, entirely undiminished. At night, when conditions align, the icebergs in Disco Bay glow faintly blue in moonlight, their internal ice compressed over millennia into a density that absorbs every color of light except the one wavelength that survives the journey through. A color found almost nowhere else on Earth, and one that early Inuit legend associated with the presence of ancestral spirits still moving through the water. The town of Ilulissat itself, home to several thousand residents, has built its modern economy substantially around the glacier that dominates its horizon. Tourism drawn by the sheer visual scale of the ice fjord, alongside a fishing industry that has operated in these waters for generations. The two economies coexisting in a town where a hunter's small open boat might share the harbor with a cruise ship's tendercraft on any given summer afternoon. Local guides, many from families who have fished these waters for multiple generations, describe reading the ice fjord's moods with the same close attention their grandparents once applied purely for survival rather than for visitors' benefit. Scientists monitoring Surmek Kujalek have recorded dramatic increases in the glacier's flow rate over recent decades, ice moving toward the sea at speeds that would have seemed extraordinary to researchers studying the same glacier a century earlier. This acceleration has made Ilulissat a focal point for climate research precisely because the changes here are neither subtle nor slow. A glacier's retreat, unlike many environmental changes, can be measured, photographed, and compared year over year with a clarity that few other indicators of a warming planet can match. Human beings have lived on this coastline for roughly 4,500 years, though not continuously. Successive waves of migration arrived from what is now Arctic Canada, each culture adapting to conditions that offered little room for error, and several ultimately vanishing when climate shifts made survival, even for the most skilled hunters, no longer possible. The Thule people, ancestors of Greenland's modern Inuit population, arrived roughly 1,000 years ago, bringing with them technology refined over centuries in the Arctic. The kayak, engineered for silent single-hunter pursuit of seals. The umiak, a larger skin boat built for whale hunting and family transport. And the komutik, a sled built without a single nail. Its wooden or bone components lashed together with sinew in a design flexible enough to absorb the shock of rough sea ice without shattering. Sled dogs remain, even now, essential working animals across much of Greenland's north and east, bred specifically for pulling rather than companionship, kept largely outdoors year-round in a climate their coats are built to withstand. A skilled musher reads a dog team's behavior the way a sailor reads wind, subtle shifts in gait or attention, signaling thin ice ahead long before any human eye could detect the danger directly. Records from Arctic ethnographers describe the specific bond between hunter and dog team as one built on mutual, practical dependence rather than sentiment, though affection, by most accounts, developed regardless. Traditional subsistence hunting, seal, narwhal, occasionally polar bear under strict modern quota systems, remains legally protected and culturally central in many communities, even as imported food and modern infrastructure have changed daily life considerably. Elders in northern settlements describe hunting not as a hobby or a heritage performance for outsiders, but as an ongoing, practical relationship with an environment that has always demanded expertise rather than sentiment in exchange for survival. Seal hunting in particular required, and still requires, a specific patience that outside observers often find difficult to appreciate. A hunter waiting motionless beside a breathing hole in the ice for hours at a stretch, watching for the faint ripple that signals a seal has surfaced to breathe below the surface, ready to strike within a fraction of a second once that ripple appears. Records from Arctic anthropologists describe this waiting not as passive, but as a form of intense, sustained attention that young hunters spent years learning to sustain, since impatience or distraction meant returning home without food for a family that depended on the catch. Communal sharing of a successful hunt remains, in many settlements, a structural rather than optional feature of daily life. Meat from a large catch, like a narwhal or seal, distributed according to customary rules that ensured elders, widows, and families without an active hunter still received a share, regardless of who had actually made the kill. Anthropologists studying these sharing systems describe them as a form of social insurance developed over centuries, a recognition that any single hunter's success or failure on a given day was, to some degree, a matter of luck and weather as much as skill, and that a community's survival depended on nobody going without, simply because they had drawn a harder day. Long before Denmark's modern administration of Greenland began, and centuries before most of Europe knew this coastline existed at all, Norse settlers arrived here under the leadership of Erik the Red, exiled from Iceland around 985 CE after a series of violent disputes, and in need of new land to offer prospective colonists. The name he chose for this harsh, icebound coast, Greenland, has been debated by historians for centuries, most concluding it was a deliberate act of promotion rather than description, an early example of what modern marketers might recognize as strategic rebranding, intended to make cold, difficult terrain sound appealing to Icelandic farmers, considering the crossing. The Norse settlements that followed, the eastern and western settlements, never actually located in the directions their names suggest, grew to a population historians estimate at several thousand at their peak, supporting churches, a cathedral at Gardar, and even, according to surviving records, a bishop appointed directly from Rome. For roughly 4 centuries, Norse Greenlanders farmed livestock, traded walrus ivory to Europe, and maintained contact, however intermittent, with the wider medieval world. Archaeological excavations at Norse farmstead sites have uncovered a surprisingly rich material culture for such a remote outpost. Imported glassware, church bells cast in Europe and transported across the North Atlantic, chess pieces carved from walrus ivory in styles matching contemporary European craftsmanship. This evidence suggests a settlement that saw itself, at least initially, as a genuine extension of European Christendom rather than an isolated frontier community. Its residents maintaining tithe payments to the church in Rome and following continental fashions in dress and architecture as closely as distance and available materials allowed. And then, sometime in the 15th century, they vanished entirely. No single document records the end. Archaeological evidence suggests a gradual decline rather than sudden catastrophe. A cooling climate during what researchers now call the Little Ice Age, environmental strain from farming practices poorly suited to increasingly harsh conditions, declining trade contact with Europe, and, some researchers argue, growing competition and conflict with Inuit populations for the same coastal resources. By the time later European expeditions searched for the Norse settlements, they found only ruins and no living Norse Greenlanders anywhere on the island. Isotopic analysis of Norse skeletal remains from the settlement's final generations reveals a telling shift in diet. Communities that had once relied primarily on farmed livestock, gradually incorporating more marine resources, seals and fish, appearing in greater proportion as the centuries progressed. Evidence, researchers argue, of a population adapting under real environmental pressure rather than simply maintaining unchanged European farming habits until sudden collapse. Some archaeologists suggest the final Norse Greenlanders may have been attempting exactly the kind of adaptation that allowed Inuit communities to thrive on the same coastline, only beginning that adjustment too late, and too gradually, to reverse a decline already well underway. The disappearance remains, by most modern historical assessments, less a single mystery than a slow accumulation of failures. A colony that had once seemed a successful adaptation to Arctic life, ultimately proving less resilient than the Inuit populations who continued thriving on the very same coastline, using very different methods, for centuries afterward and to this day. Nuuk, Greenland's capital and largest settlement, holds barely 20,000 residents, small by almost any international standard for a national capital, and yet home to nearly a third of the entire island's population, a concentration that reflects just how thinly settled the rest of Greenland actually is. The city occupies a site of genuine antiquity, founded in 1728 by Danish-Norwegian missionary Hans Egede, on a location Inuit communities had already inhabited for centuries before European contact, drawn by the same natural harbor and rich fishing grounds that still support the modern settlement's economy. Egede's original mission, according to historical accounts, sought to locate descendants of the vanished Norse colonists, a search that ultimately failed, but left behind the permanent Danish colonial presence that would shape Greenland's political trajectory for the next 3 centuries. Modern Nuuk mixes brightly painted traditional wooden houses, a legacy of Danish colonial building policy, with contemporary apartment blocks and government buildings reflecting Greenland's evolving status. A former Danish colony, then an integrated county, and since 2009, a self-governing nation within the Danish realm, controlling most domestic affairs while foreign policy and defense remain coordinated with Copenhagen. Fish markets in Nuuk's harbor still open before dawn. Hunters and fishermen selling seal, halibut, and shrimp directly from small boats to residents who arrive with their own containers. A transaction pattern little changed across generations, even as the harbor around it has filled with satellite dishes and shipping containers. Greenlandic, an Inuit language quite unrelated to Danish, is taught in schools alongside Danish and increasingly English, part of a broader cultural movement toward reasserting indigenous identity after decades of Danish language dominance in administration and education. The 2009 Act on Greenland's Self-Government marked what many residents describe as the most significant political milestone in the island's modern history, granting Greenland's parliament authority over natural resources, justice administration, and a formal legal pathway toward eventual full independence, should residents choose to pursue it through referendum. Records from Greenlandic political debates of the period describe genuine, ongoing tension between the economic reality of continued reliance on Danish subsidies, which still constitute a substantial portion of the territory's budget, and a strong cultural and political desire for full sovereignty that surveys suggest most Greenlanders continue to support in principle. Nuuk's population has grown steadily as younger Greenlanders migrate from smaller settlements, seeking education and employment unavailable in villages of a few hundred people, a pattern that has left some remote communities with aging populations and uncertain long-term futures, even as the capital itself expands. University-level education, largely unavailable within Greenland until relatively recently, now draws students to Nuuk's own institution of higher learning, though many Greenlandic students still travel to Denmark for degrees not yet offered domestically, maintaining an educational relationship with the former colonial power that persists even as political independence movements gain strength. In Quanaq, and the settlements scattered across Greenland's remote northwest, among the northernmost permanently inhabited communities on Earth, traditional subsistence hunting remains not a preserved custom, but genuinely ongoing daily practice, shaped by a landscape offering almost no alternative economic activity for much of the year. Hunters here still pursue narwhal using kayaks and hand-thrown harpoons in techniques largely unchanged for generations, a method chosen partly from tradition and partly from practical necessity. The sound of a motor, hunters explain, alerts these deeply sound-sensitive animals long before a boat can approach close enough for a successful hunt. A successful narwhal hunt provides meat, blubber rich in essential nutrients, scarce elsewhere in an Arctic diet, and the long spiraled tusk itself, historically traded to Europe as unicorn horn, at prices exceeding gold before its true biological origin became widely understood. That historical trade left a curious mark on European culture that persists to this day. Medieval and early modern European royalty prized narwhal tusks as genuine unicorn horns, believed to neutralize poison and possess genuine magical properties, some tusks mounted in elaborate gold settings and displayed as among a royal treasury's most valuable possessions. Records suggest Queen Elizabeth I once received a single narwhal tusk valued at roughly the price of an entire castle, a transaction made possible by merchants who either genuinely believed or found it extremely profitable to claim they believed that these spiraled ivory lengths came from a mythical land creature rather than an Arctic whale most Europeans of the era had never seen and could scarcely have imagined. Winter darkness here lasts for months at a stretch, the sun disappearing entirely below the horizon from roughly October through February in the northernmost settlements, replaced by a persistent blue twilight and, on clear nights, the aurora borealis, moving in slow curtains of green and occasionally red across the sky. Communities adapt their entire rhythm of life to this extended darkness, hunting when moonlight or the aurora itself provides enough illumination to travel safely across sea ice by dog sled. Climate change has altered hunting conditions considerably, even in these remote communities, according to accounts collected from local hunters and Arctic researchers alike. Sea ice that once formed reliably each autumn now arrives later and breaks up earlier, shortening the safe hunting season and forcing adaptations that hunters describe with a mixture of frustration and grim practicality. Knowledge developed over generations, suddenly requiring revision within a single human lifetime. Younger hunters in these communities increasingly combine traditional techniques with modern equipment, a GPS device carried alongside inherited knowledge of currents and ice patterns, a rifle used alongside the harpoon for certain hunts, where regulations and practical safety both favor it. Elders interviewed by Arctic researchers describe this blending not as a loss of tradition, but as its natural continuation, noting that Inuit hunting culture has always incorporated new tools when they genuinely improved a hunter's chances, from the earliest adoption of European rifles more than a century ago, through to satellite phones carried today for emergency communication across vast, unpopulated stretches of sea ice and tundra. Greenland's position within the Arctic Circle produces an experience of daylight that visitors from temperate latitudes often describe as genuinely disorienting on first encounter. Weeks or months of continuous sunlight in summer, followed by an equivalent stretch of near-total darkness in winter, the two extremes separated by rapid, dramatic shifts each spring and autumn. In settlements north of the Arctic Circle, the midnight sun means a child can play outdoors at what would elsewhere be considered the middle of the night, the sun tracing a low, continuous circle around the horizon, rather than rising and setting in the conventional sense. Longtime residents describe an adjustment period each season, sleep schedules loosening in summer's endless light and tightening again as winter darkness compresses each day's usable hours toward almost nothing. The polar night that follows carries its own specific psychological weight, one that public health researchers in Greenland and across the Arctic have studied directly, documenting genuine seasonal effects on mood and energy that communities have developed their own cultural responses to over generations. Communal gatherings, specific foods associated with midwinter, and celebrations timed deliberately to coincide with the sun's eventual, gradual return. That return, when it comes, carries its own ritual weight in many communities. The first sunrise after months of darkness marked, in some settlements, by residents gathering outdoors specifically to witness it, a moment that outside observers might consider simply an astronomical event, but that Greenlandic communities across generations have treated as something closer to an annual, communal exhale. Schools and workplaces across Greenland have developed their own practical adaptations to these extremes, some adjusting operating hours seasonally rather than maintaining a fixed schedule poorly suited to either the endless summer light or the long winter dark. Health authorities have documented genuine seasonal patterns in sleep and mood across the population, findings that have shaped public health guidance in ways that differ considerably from approaches developed in more temperate latitudes, where day length varies far less dramatically across the year. Along Greenland's rugged east coast, communities like Tasiilaq remain among the most isolated, permanently inhabited settlements on the planet, reachable only by boat during the brief ice-free season, or by helicopter and small aircraft the rest of the year, with no road connecting them to any other settlement on the island. This isolation has preserved, according to anthropologists who have studied the region, cultural practices and dialects that diverged noticeably from West Greenlandic communities across centuries of limited contact, East Greenlanders developing their own distinct traditions around hunting, storytelling, and craft that reflect the specific, unforgiving geography of a coastline hemmed in by mountains on one side and drift ice on the other for much of the year. Traditional drum dancing and storytelling, once nearly suppressed under earlier waves of Christian missionary influence, have experienced deliberate cultural revival in recent decades, communities actively working to preserve oral histories and traditional knowledge that missionaries and colonial administrators had, in earlier generations, actively discouraged. Elders who learned these traditions as children now teach them formally to a younger generation, growing up with internet access and international travel largely unavailable to their grandparents. East Greenland's contact with the outside world came notably later than West Greenland's, with sustained European presence not fully established until the early 20th century, meaning traditional practices here retained a distinctiveness that missionary-influenced West Greenlandic communities had, in some cases, already begun losing decades earlier. Linguists studying the East Greenlandic dialect describe vocabulary and pronunciation differences substantial enough that West and East Greenlanders sometimes rely on Danish as a practical common language, despite both speaking recognizably related Inuit languages. Life in these settlements remains genuinely demanding by any external standard. Limited healthcare access, extreme weather that can isolate a community for days or weeks at a stretch, and an economy still substantially dependent on hunting and fishing, supplemented by government support. And yet residents interviewed across multiple documented accounts describe a specific attachment to this landscape that outsiders often find difficult to fully understand. Not romanticized hardship, but a genuine sense that this particular relationship between a people and an unforgiving coastline has produced something worth preserving on its own terms. Tourism has begun reaching even these remote settlements in recent years, drawn by exactly the isolation and dramatic scenery that once made East Greenland so difficult to reach in the first place, and communities have responded with a mixture of cautious economic opportunity and concern about preserving the specific cultural character that isolation helped protect. Local guides increasingly lead visitors on dog sled trips and hikes among the drift ice, translating a landscape and way of life shaped over centuries into an experience visitors can witness, briefly and respectfully, without fundamentally altering the community's own relationship to the place they call home. Greenland's ice sheet is melting at a rate that has accelerated dramatically within the span of a single human generation, glaciologists tracking losses that, if the ice sheet were to melt entirely, would raise global sea levels by more than 7 meters, a scenario researchers consider unlikely within any near-term time frame, but one that underscores the genuine scale of what is currently underway. For coastal communities, this change is not an abstraction glimpsed in scientific reports, but a directly observed feature of daily life. Sea ice forming later and breaking earlier each year, traditional dog sled hunting routes becoming unreliable or impassable, and species distributions shifting as warming waters alter the marine ecosystem that coastal hunting has depended on for millennia. Some fishing communities have adapted by shifting toward species newly abundant in warming waters. Others have watched traditional livelihoods become increasingly difficult to sustain within a single working lifetime. Greenlandic scientists and hunters alike have become, almost by necessity, close collaborators with international climate researchers. Indigenous observational knowledge, developed over generations, proving genuinely valuable to scientific understanding of changes that instruments alone struggle to fully capture. This collaboration represents, according to researchers who have worked directly with Greenlandic communities, a rare instance of traditional ecological knowledge and modern climate science informing each other as equals rather than one simply validating the other. Greenland's own economy has begun exploring what a warmer future might practically mean, with mining interests examining newly accessible mineral deposits as retreating ice exposes bedrock previously buried beneath the ice sheet for millennia, and agricultural experiments testing whether crops entirely unsuited to the historical Greenlandic climate might eventually take root in a lengthening, warming growing season. Records from Greenland's own government planning documents describe genuine ambivalence about these possibilities. Economic opportunity that could reduce dependence on Danish subsidies, weighed against environmental and cultural costs that many Greenlanders view with considerable unease. What remains uncertain, even to the people living through it most directly, is how much of the traditional Arctic way of life described throughout this documentary can adapt fast enough to survive changes, now measured in decades rather than centuries, a question that communities across Greenland are answering, in real time, through the same combination of adaptability and hard-won practical knowledge that has defined survival on this coastline for thousands of years.